Sienna God, hello all. Oshta, afternoon, good afternoon, and Wado, thank you for watching. Did you miss me? I was recouping from my hamstring, my pulled hamstring, my hammy, my poor hammy. Anyway, this is day 8 of reading Black Rednecks and White Liberals by Thomas Sowell, Part A. So that was like really, really crazy when they were talking about the last sentence that I read where it said, in order to minimize larger society's adverse reactions to Jews in general, included pointed lessons on the use of soap and water. Like, I had no idea. I mean, because of course you're going to have in each culture or race or whatever, you're going to have the group that's just like, right? Well, I didn't realize that that was within the Jewish community. I had no idea. I didn't know that there was, because I mean, like, if you look at the TV shows and movies that are depicted, it's like Vikings that are living like less than ideal, hygienically and stuff. Native Americans early on, you know, living that way. I mean, they weren't getting up and going and washing their hands in the creek like every whatever, you know. I had no idea that it was like that with the Jews, because they don't really, unless they're depicted in like the concentration camps and stuff, which then of course you're not going to have access to good personal hygienic type stuff, right? But I didn't know that it was like that. Like, I was like, what? Whoa, that's crazy town banana pants. Anyway, when Western or Eastern European Jews moved into German Jewish neighborhoods in Chicago, the German Jews moved out, both in Chicago and in New York at that time. Most Eastern European Jews could not afford to live where German Jews lived in the first place. German Jews were willing to employ Eastern European Jews, but living near them was something else. Moreover, even within the poorer Eastern European Jewish neighborhoods on the Lower East Side of New York, Hungarian Jews had their own enclaves, separate from the enclaves of Russian or Polish Jews. There was a quote-unquote low intermarriage rate, end quote, among these various subgroups of Eastern European Jews, and a, end quote, mutual incomprehension and intolerance that kept Jews apart, end quote. Mutual aid societies among the Jews were likewise broken down by nationality groups. Among other breakdowns, even in the small Jewish communities back in colonial America, Sephardic Jews, Sephardic, were known to disown children who married Ashkenazic Jews, Ashkenazic. Similar sectarian, national, and ideological divisions split Jewish communities throughout the Western Hemisphere and in Europe. In 18th century France, Sephardic Jews expressed the same views as some Gentiles, that Ashkenazic Jews were not yet ready for equal citizenship. Wow, what? In some places, neither marriage nor burial crossed these lines of internal division. Oh, there's an asterisk. So they wouldn't even allow them to be buried in the same cemetery, y'all. Okay, now before I read any further, I'm just going to say, isn't this kind of like the pot calling the kettle black? I'm just saying. And just, okay, I'm shooting straight from the hip. That's the only way that I know how to do it. But they were literally almost wiped out, right? I don't know. Were they? Were they all concentrated in the one area? Or was it just a certain type of Jew, like certain, because you know, like they have like Ashkenazic and Sephardic and then the German and the Russian and the stuff, you know what I mean? So like, really, were they almost already all wiped out, or was a certain like subset? I guess I don't know how do you say that. What's the PC term for that? But how are you going to be like in an uproar about all of that, the segregation, the genocidal stuff, and all that stuff, when you're literally segregating inside your own thing? It'd be like, oh well, you can't mingle with them Southern Baptists because, you know, it's only them Northern Baptists or them Eastern Baptists or them Western Baptists. You know, I don't know. You know what I mean? But how are you doing that? That don't make no goddamn sense to me. But anyway, let's go on to the asterisk. When I was in Australia during my research on ethnic groups around the world, members of Jewish groups in Sydney and Melbourne both went to great lengths to tell me of the differences between the Jews who had settled in these cities. Both also repeated the same saying, end quote, Melbourne, Melbourne, is a cold city with warm Jews, and Sydney is a warm city with cold Jews. Come on, like, how are you segregating yourselves like that? How are you doing that, man? but nobody else can say anything, right? Only y'all can make fun of each other. Only y'all can ostracize each other, right? Nobody else. Because somebody else does, and it's anti-Semitic. You're an anti-Semite. If you say anything even remotely, like, am I anti-Semitic by asking these questions? Like, get the heck out of here. Similarly, among the overseas Chinese in Southeast Asia and the Western Hemisphere, where people from different parts of China belong to different formal and informal networks and live separate social lives, even speaking mutually unintelligible dialects, and specialize in different sectors of the economy, as a scholarly study noted. Were the comprador, C-O-M-P-R-A-D-O-R, of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank in Singapore to be a Cantonese, it was less likely that a merchant who was Teochew, Teochew, could gain access to the Hong Kong Bank. Oh wow. Chinese banks themselves were dominated by these dialect and kin divisions, K-I-N divisions. For example, the Chinese Commercial Bank, in parentheses, established in 1912, close parentheses, Ho Hong. There's a place called Ho Ho Chinese barbecue that we used to frequent. So I was like, Anyway, Ho Hong Bank, in parentheses, 1917, close parentheses, and the Overseas Chinese Bank, in parentheses, 1919, close parentheses, were all Hokkien or Hokkien, H-O-K-K-I-E-N banks. Li Wah, W-A-H Bank, open parentheses, 1920, close parentheses, was a Cantonese bank. The Overseas Union was a Teochew bank. Here, not only the directors and officers, but also the customers and depositors were drawn from a similar dialect background. Man, so you can't even bank in certain areas. What? Among the Lebanese, there was certainly no solidarity between Christian and Muslim, M-O-S-L-E-M, Lebanese. Moreover, among the Muslims, there were divisions between the Sunni, S-U-N-N-I, and the Shiites, S-H-I-I-T-E-S. And among the Christians, there were divisions among Catholics, Maronites, M-A-R-O-N-I-T-E-S, and Orthodox. These, of course, all had separate religious institutions, but they also had separate social and business networks. Among the Lebanese who settled in Australia, in quotes, their regional loyalties seldom extended beyond that of the village, end quote. Whoa. In Lebanon, from which they had come, a history of bitter and lethal intergroup violence in Lebanon and Syria, taken thousands of lives at a time, was part of the legacy that Lebanese took to other countries in which they settled. Even in a small country like Sierra Leone, the many internal disputes among various Lebanese factions, which spilled over into the courts and involved political authorities, proved too baffling for either Europeans or Africans to understand, much less settle. During the colonial era, indeed, one of the main tasks of diplomatic representatives from Lebanon and Sierra Leone after independence was to arbitrate these internal disputes among various Lebanese factions there. Conflicts among various Lebanese Shiite groups spread as far as Australia, and conflict among Lebanese political groups led to the assassination of a refugee from Lebanon living in Brazil. The various Indian middlemen minorities, such as the Gujaratis, G-U-J-A-R-A-T-I-S, and the Chettiars, C-H-E-T-T-I-A-R-S, I don't know, have had separate social and economic institutions, both in India and in the many countries where they have settled overseas, as a study of Indian immigration pointed out. In quotes, most Indians immigrate primarily as members of their subgroup as Gujaratis or Jahardis, Jains, J-A-I-N-S, Sikhs, S-A-K-H-S, or Muslims, M-U-S-L-I-M-S. And end quote, and most, end quote, still have arranged marriages within their subgroup, end quote. Another study of Indians in East Africa notes that they have been, end quotes, fragmented into so many linguistic or religious caste, C-A-S-T-E, and other subgroups, as to constitute a community almost exclusively in the minds of outsiders. For notes that they have been fragmented into so many linguistics. I kind of like, they're not, like, we're not fragmenting them. You know what I'm saying? They're fragmenting themselves. And then they want to act like we're fragmenting them. Like, get the heck out of here. Anyway, this is just crazy. The Armenian community in the Ottoman Empire was likewise in quotes, beset by factionalism, end quote. The difference is not between atomistic independence and group-wide ties, subgroup ties, and loyalties within middleman minorities have often been intense, but have seldom encompassed all of the people lumped together by others. Education. As communities determined to maintain their own values and work ethic without allowing their children to be influenced by very different values they often found in the societies around them, middleman minorities have often had their own social institutions, including their own private schools, after they reached an economic level where they could afford them. Even when their children went to public schools, as among Jews in the United States, there were often supplementary schools, such as the Hebrew schools. In other countries, there were often full-time private schools for the children of middleman minorities, teaching in the Chinese language, the Ghardi language, or whatever the particular language of the particular middleman minority might be. Education has for centuries been a high priority among Jews, even in times and places where illiteracy was the norm among the people around them. A Russian official reported on the Jews in Russian-conquered Poland in 1818, and quotes, almost every one of their families hires a tutor to teach its children, end quote, and, in quotes, their entire population studies, end quote, he added. Girls, too, can read, even the girls of the poorest families. Every family, be it in the most modest circumstances, buys books because there will be at least 10 books in every household. Most of those inhabiting the huts, in brackets, Gentile, close brackets, villages, have only recently heard of an alphabet book. Nearly 2 centuries later, when television host Brian Lamb, Brianlamb, asked author Abigail Thernstrom, Thermstrom, why Jews scored so well on the Scholastic Aptitude Test, she replied, end quotes, they have been preparing for it for 1,000 years, end quote. This is not to say that education was necessarily the factor that first lifted middleman minorities out of poverty. Among the immigrant Jews in America, for example, most worked in manual occupations during the last decades of the 19th century, and no Jewish child in New York City graduated from a public high school then, because the first graduating class from a public high school in New York was the class of 1902. A survey of City College students in 1951, when most of these students were Jewish, showed that only 17% of their fathers who were born before 1911 had completed the 8th grade. Wow. But Jews were already beginning to rise economically. Their economic improvement meant that their children's labor was no longer necessary to enable the family to survive, so that these children could now go on to finish high school or college. Higher education was the effect rather than the cause of their initial rise, and it would also become the vehicle by which later generations of Jews could move on into the professions. Even before that was possible, however, the intellectual interest was manifest. A survey of public libraries in New York's Lower East Side tenement neighborhoods where Russian Jews lived in 1912 showed that over half the books borrowed were nonfiction, and that most of the fiction was by such authors as Tolstoy, Tolstoy, Dumas, Dumas, and Dickens. While lightweight bestsellers gathered dust on the shelves, New York's free public libraries, free public lectures, and above all, free city colleges were a godsend to the Jews. Now, earlier I spelled Muslims, and we all know how that's spelled, but if I'm not mistaken, I could really believe that I saw it spelled Moslims, Muslims, which it brings me to the pronunciation of the word when, no, it's not over there. What's his face? Oh yes, Malcolm X. In that movie that Denzel Washington did. And then all back then, when like all those movies were done, they would talk, there it is. Okay, so it says, moreover, among the Moslems, Muslims, there were division between the Sunni and the Shiites. I knew I saw it. So talking about Muslims, Muslims, I have no idea what the difference is, but I'm just telling you that it's spelled different in here. Okay. Popularities, lectures of God's and the Jews. Make sure that I'm right here. All right, I'm in the right spot. When the College of the City of New York, once known as the working man's Harvard, was a distinguished institution that admitted students strictly on their academic records. 3/4 of its students were Jewish. Some other colleges, notably Harvard, set upper limits on the number of Jewish students they would admit because of fear that otherwise Jews would overrun the institution. Shut the front door. I had no idea that they did that. What? And I was like, oh, we're going to put a cap on this nationality or whatever. Oh my gosh, no way. That's crazy. Yeah, overrun the institution because so many were so highly qualified. Similar limits were placed on the admissions of Jews to various universities in Eastern Europe between the two world wars and in the Soviet Union after World War II for similar reasons. What? And you want to tell me that they're not in everything? Like, come on. You cannot have, like, smart, successful people just sit back and do nothing. Like, I'm done. No, they're going to be all up in everything. And they're, for generations, they're going to be in everything. Spreading out like a vine. You know what I'm saying? Education, because they're not going to see no poverty. Like, get the heck out of here. They're like, nope, not on my watch. I don't know. World domination, right? I don't know what their goal is, but anyway, education was likewise not the basis for the initial rise of Lebanese immigrants in many societies, although they came from a country with a tradition of education. 29% of the Lebanese immigrants who arrived in Brazil between 1908 and 1936 were illiterate, as were a majority of those who arrived in the first wave of Lebanese immigrants to 19th century Australia. While most of those who immigrated to Mexico in the 19th century had not completed elementary school, and those among them who were illiterate often kept letters from home for months until they could find someone to read them to them. In Sierra Leone, the Europeanized Africans in Freetown initially, in quotes, looked down on the Lebanese because they were uneducated and poor, end quote. Later, this contempt, end quote, turned into dislike and even hatred when the Lebanese were successful in business, end quote. As with the Jews, the Lebanese first rose in occupations not requiring education, but their tradition of respect for education then manifested itself in their later successful rise into the professions. The same pattern could be seen on the other side of the world among the Chinese minority in Indonesia. Everywhere they went, the Chinese carried with them their reverence for learning. Oh, in quotes. That was in quotes. And then end quote. Even though the earliest Chinese immigrants to Indonesia, in quotes, were many of them illiterate, end quote. In Burma, as late as 1931, there were more illiterate Chinese males than literate ones. What the overseas Chinese had was not necessarily more education than others, but more of an aspiration for education, which their economic rise through other means would allow them to fulfill. What was said of the Lebanese in the Dominican Republic, in quotes, having achieved success in the commercial and industrial sphere, many Lebanese encouraged their sons to enter the professions, end quote, could be said of Lebanese in other countries and of Jews and overseas Chinese as well. In 19th century Germany and Austria, the Jewish intelligentsia, I think that's how you say it, Intelligentsia, was overwhelmingly from families that had succeeded in business. Jewish students, like students from other middleman minorities, tended to specialize in the more difficult and rewarding fields such as science, medicine, and law. In a later era, Chinese Americans would specialize disproportionately in engineering and science. Even the era of anti-Chinese feeling in the United States before World War II, Chinese school children were among the favorites of teachers for their academic performance and their good behavior. At the college level, Asian American students have consistently scored higher than white American students on the mathematics portion of the Scholastic Aptitude Test. However, Asian American success in academia and in later careers is not simply a reflection of higher test scores. A scholarly study found that white students had to have IQs 15 points higher to match either the educational or the economic performances of Asian Americans. Does it go ahead and get you any good shots? Till we meet again. Love you, mean it.